And we have returned to listening to CSC Talk Radio. This is Beth Ann, and we're in the final segment of today's show. We're talking about buying American. Made in America. What if everything was made in America again? Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's like, I was reading this. I'm going to let you address what we were talking about before we went to the break. But I was reading an article yesterday by Victor Davis Hanson. I don't know if you've seen him or heard him. I just love him. He's a historian. But he was talking about what has happened in the 60s and how that's affecting today. And I said, well, if the 60s won, who lost? Because we lost, and jobs was, and some of this started back then. And so it's, we're reaping what we sow. Some things were good and some things were not. But buying made in America is so important. And it's, I'm kind of turn it over to you. We're trying to get your book out there. We're trying to get your new website set up, and we're going to get that done, and we're going to be a part of it. I want to be a part of it, Jim.
Well, it's just such a great pleasure, Beth, connecting with you and with your listeners on this important thing. For those who weren't with us the first time, this really got a hold of me and wouldn't let go, and I'm hoping that it won't let go to our listeners. I took that light bulb out one night that had the GE logo on it, and under it in all caps the word China. And boy, it just grabbed a hold of me. I'm going, if GE's making its light bulbs in China, do we have a problem? And sure enough, we do. Now GM's making its Buick Envisions in China. Who would have thought, that we would ever be doing that? So,
and let me just emphasize on that, because Congress decided we had to have this one kind of light bulb, and every one of those is made in China. So Congress went against us on that.
They did, and yet the story is even more complicated than that. It's funny because that incandescent light bulb that I had, it turned out that the last GE incandescent light bulb factory was in Winchester, Virginia, and they closed it. And you go through to Winchester now, and you can see it's one of those down in the mouth communities. And there was a proposal to reopen it and to make the new kind of light bulbs there, but we didn't do it because we went for the low price in China, and that's just that. Either going for profit or because that's what the competitors are doing. So we sold ourselves down the river. You mentioned in the 60s, there is a history here, and I commend to our listeners the first few chapters of my book where I walk us through that first 50 years of doing this with Japan and then 20 years of doing this with China. And in the 1960s, we were busily giving away our economy to the Japanese.
Yes, we were.
So it's a sad history of our doing these things. And I noticed an article in this morning's Wall Street Journal talking about how in the early 1990s we had a big tussle with China about their unfair trade practices, and we threatened them with tariffs, and then they agreed to do all these things we asked them to do, and we didn't impose the tariffs. And of course they did none of those things. And yet that was in 1992, and you wonder, why was Bill Clinton telling us in 2000 what a wonderful idea it was to admit China to the World Trade Organization and to drop our tariffs on China, reduce them to almost nothing. It's just very dismaying that our leaders would be leading us down this road. But that's why I wrote this book, that we can become informed in a way that even I was not before I researched it, and wake up and say to our elected officials, enough of this, but more importantly, take the power into our own hands.
We do need to take the power into our own hands, and I think the American people need to know that, and that's the consumer. The consumer has the power. And I did a show a few years ago about just like Dorothy with the ruby slippers. We had the power all along. We just didn't realize it. We have the power in the vote. Right. We have the power in our dollar, how we spend our money. But even the consumer will go for that bottom dollar. Well, this is 2 cents cheaper, or this is 5 cents cheaper, or whatever, right. And so you get what you pay for, whether it's a cheap product or ruining jobs here in the U.S.
That's right, and or creating a lot of social problems. I call it the high cost of low price. And you were talking earlier about the effects of some of this. So what you see, a good example I ran across was when they closed the Delco Auto Parts factory in Flint, Michigan, and they reopened it in Reynosa, Mexico. What do we think that did to Flint? Flint is a terrible place now because for one simple reason, there are no jobs because we're going for the low price. And so they've done some studies now, and we've all heard about the opioid crisis, and there are also deaths from suicide and deaths from drinking ourselves to death. The economists that study this call those deaths of despair, and the dramatic increase of those deaths directly correlates to the increase in the deficit with China. And when you go on my website, I've got that graph there. And so you realize that when we go for that low price, we're paying a high cost that we're just not thinking about.
The unintended consequences that come with those decisions.
That's right.
And
we have to say, get out of just the immediacy of the moment. And, many of us can't afford to do that because often we are going to pay a higher price for the thing that's made here. But I'm reminded of the woman in Bangladesh who was making clothing for Walmart, being paid 16 cents an hour. They asked her for a penny more, and Walmart said, no, we're going to cut you a penny an hour. Is actually what we're going to do. And they brought her to America, to the Walmart store where her shorts were for sale, and they saw a shopper there, and she said, I'm so poor I can't afford to pay. I can't buy those $14 shorts. I've got to buy these $7 shorts that were made in Bangladesh. But that's the vicious circle. The reason she can't afford it is because we send all our jobs overseas.
Right. It's
so we
crazy.
need to break out of that vicious circle, and sometimes you do need to pay a bit more for something because you paid somebody a fair wage for making it.
And buying locally. That's
absolutely.
one way, especially when we're talking about the right to know. I want to know more about that. But when we talk about the right to know, and here in rural America, we're talking about our meat, our food, our produce, and you have the right to know where that came from. You have the right to know, and people like Senator Sass, they don't think you do. They don't think that it doesn't matter where that hamburger came from, and yet they keep piling on the mandates and the regulations to America's farmers and ranchers and producers. Yet those that come in here, they don't have to abide by those same high standards. So buy locally.
And they won't even tell us.
Yeah,
exactly. Buying local is really a terrific thing to do, and buy from your local store as well. You talk about rural America and these communities that are the heart of our community, and stores closing because we are all just so happy to get that cheap thing off the internet and have it delivered to our door, but we're not really thinking, well, would you like to have a downtown to go visit and have an encounter with a human being? Maybe we should stop and think about that.
Yeah, and I do prefer that myself, but then I'm old, so I do prefer that. I prefer to try things on. I prefer to look at it and hold it and know what it really looks like and such. But we're out of time. We've got you already scheduled to be back here in a few weeks, and I'm looking forward to that. We're going to keep this going because we've got to keep this in the earshot of my listeners and in the earshots of America, because when we buy American, you know what we're doing? We're bringing America home. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jim.